Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Audit and Risk Committee meeting, once again online. So thank you for your endurance in that respect. The meeting will be recorded as, indeed is being recorded as I speak. So if we could try and observe the usual protocol that the first time you speak, if you could just tell us who you are, that would be helpful. Other than that, if you want to come in with a question, if you could try and use the hand function, and if that fails, then just call out as loudly as you can. So that's bound to get my attention. So hopefully that's sufficient by way of guidance. So welcome again to this meeting. We have apologies today from Tim Wright, Pat Kenny, and Gary Devlin. Heather, is that everyone I've picked up?
That's right, Brian.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We have two items that we're planning to take in the private session. Both relate to security, so therefore it's a bit obvious why we want to do these in private, but it's important that we have, in my opinion, these in the private session to allow a fully frank and open discussion of what are very important matters. Are people content that we deal with these in private? Yeah, I see nods and thumbs up, so that's great. Moving on to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest relating to matters on the agenda? No, I don't see anything, so thank you for that. And obviously, should anything arise during the course of the discussion, please bring it to my attention. Thank you. Then that takes us into the agenda proper, and the first item there are the minutes of the meeting on the 14th of October. Firstly, in terms of accuracy of record, are we content that these are an accurate record of that discussion? Yeah, thank you very much. And then in terms of matters arising, is there anything in the minutes which is otherwise not picked up on the agenda that anyone wants to raise? No, that was painless. Okay, thank you very much. And then that takes us on to the action log. Heather, do you just want to take us through this, please?
Thank you, Chair. Yep. Heather Gregg, Board Support Team. There are 9 actions on the action log, 7 of which have been marked as completed. So it's just to confirm that the committee are content with the position statement updates and for these to be removed accordingly. And there are 2 further actions remain green. These are items 7.2.3 in relation to water planning audit and item 7.2.4 in relation to the internal audit recommendations. There have been multiple date changes.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Updates on these can be given under item 7 on today's agenda unless there are any questions just now. But just to confirm, the committee are content with the position statement updates.
Yeah. Are we content? Yes, I think we are. Heather, just I have a few observations, and first of all, an apology. I've asked you to stick to a protocol, and of course I failed to do so myself. So in an effort to correct that, Brian Baverstock, chair of this committee. Just in terms of the specific points on the action log, the first relating to remote working and multi-factor authentication, it does appear in the later paper on penetration testing, which we're taking in the private session. So although I'm content at this stage for this to be marked as closed, I would just like to consider it more fully when we come to discuss that paper. It was just to alert you to that. And then similarly, in terms of recommendations to water planning, so items 723 and 724, we will pick these up when we talk about the follow-up of internal audit recommendations. So Heather, just to note that there are 3 items that, subject to those later discussions, we might want to come back to. Okay, thank you very much for that. That then takes us on to internal audit, and the first paper in this batch is the progress report. And Matt, are you going to, well, you'll need to talk to all these items because you're the only one here.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit last one standing on this. My colleague Jill, unfortunately, is unable to attend today. She's been taken ill earlier this week, and hopefully she'll be feeling much better later on. Just to, again, stick to protocol, I'm Matt Swan, Associate Director with ASETS, the internal auditors for the fire service. The progress report, largely speaking, is intended to be a snapshot of progress as to where we are in the delivery of the programme to date. There's a few things that I would probably just want to draw to your attention, which are primarily picked up on page 2 of our report, headed 21-22 audit plan progress. There's a couple of bits of just administration that I just want to draw to your attention, particularly in consultation with Brian in advance of the meeting, and a few more general comments that I wish to make on this. So it's probably going to be a little more fulsome presentation than perhaps I would do otherwise. The first point is one of relatively minor but clarity detail, and that's in relation to the column heading days on that page of the report. Just for clarity, that column notes the days that were originally articulated within the agreed audit plan. There's further reference a little later in the report to some additional changes and use of contingency days in relation to a couple of audits, and for clarity on future reports we'll make that clearer as to what that column is communicating to you, and then effectively, if and where there are any variations to that, we'll include that as a footnote, as indeed we have on this particular point. The other couple of bits in terms of kind of just slight tweaks to the progress, and this is just effectively a timing point in terms of when we've issued this report compared to where we are now, in relation to a couple of points. The ICT and data security follow-up work, that's now going through our review process, and the report is in the hands of one of my colleagues, Paul Kelly, for review at the moment. And the environmental sustainability, which is noted as planned, we've commenced the field work as of last week in relation to that review. So just to give a little bit of further clarity on where we are in relation to that. The other thing that I would just want to draw to your attention in relation to this report is in relation to D3 on workforce planning, where in consultation and discussion with management, we're proposing that that work is deferred until the following audit year and be for consideration in the development of the plan for 22-23. That has been discussed with members of management and effectively being replaced with an investigation piece of work in relation to trauma bags. And the couple of bits of key impacts that I just want to draw to your attention is the change there would not impact our ability to issue a fulsome opinion of the service for the year. So in making that change, it's not going to affect our ability to issue an annual report, both in terms of the overall volume of work that we're doing and in terms of the breadth of coverage planned for the year. At that point, I would very much welcome any comments from management or indeed questions from committee in relation to this report, either for things that I've mentioned or other things which are on your minds.
Thanks for that, Matt, and thanks for picking up those additional points. That's been helpful. Any comments, observations for Matt, Leslie, and then Barry?
Leslie Bloomer, member of the Audit and Assurance Committee. Thanks for that, Matt. Are you able to tell us in this session, or perhaps in the private session, a little bit more about the proposed investigation and why that's come about?
I might defer to John on this one in terms of whether that would be better to pick up here or in the private session. My leaning is probably the latter, but I will let John answer that in the first instance.
John Thompson, Acting Director of Finance and Procurement, and yes, Leslie, I will touch on it briefly, but I would prefer that we perhaps have a more detailed discussion in the private section.
Yeah. Okay, thanks for that. I think that's a sensible way to proceed. Was that it from you, Leslie? Yeah, and Mary?
Yeah, it's a small point, Brian, really, and it was just to see if we could get some assurance, definitely then from within the SLT, that the work that needs to be undertaken in order to undertake the workforce planning review we are confident that that will be able to take place relatively early in the new financial year. What's the time frame on that being completed, I guess, is what I'm asking, because I appreciate it's probably been pushed in some respects due to COVID. It might very well be that we're seeing the same situation this time next year. So I guess I'm just looking for assurance that we're confident we can undertake that work to allow that to happen.
Yeah, who's best placed to respond? John?
Yeah, just to cover that point off, my understanding is that the reason for the deferral of the work was there was a number of particular pieces of work that need to be brought to a conclusion, and it would make sense to then have that work completed. Not necessarily, Mary, to do with COVID itself. It's just that it just made sense to do that, and then there was going to be a kind of timeline. I don't know the exact date as to when it's going to be proposed. That's one of the areas that we are looking to agree is the internal audit plan for next year, and therefore that's something that we'll agree with SLT and then on to ANAC.
Okay, Mary, did you want to come back in?
If I can do, I don't have any particular issues with the deferral of workforce planning, but around RDS, it is particularly vital that this gets done. And so I guess it's just flagging up that I think where we're deferring things, we should really have a time frame for where they're being deferred to. There's a massive difference between April 2022 or March 2023 in relation to that. So, it's not a massive point, but I think where we have deferral, then we should have timeframes around that too.
Yeah, I think it's a perfectly valid point, and I think going forward, wherever we can add an anticipated date to such issues, it would be helpful. On this particular point, we will have a draft of the 22-23 audit plan at our next meeting, so by definition, we should get the clarity that we're seeking. So I think we record that as a point and an action, but we expect it to be picked up when we see the draft plan at the next meeting. I saw you came in there, Matt, but were you about to say something similar?
Yeah, pretty much word for word, Brian. It was effectively that we can make it clear when that review will be undertaken in the year. Usually for the March meeting, we'd have a slightly more indicative timeline for the audits for the year, but for that one, we can probably be a bit firmer on that one in terms of the timescale. Yeah,
no, that's really helpful. Thank you for that. Okay, if there are no further points on the progress report, that then takes us into the fire safety enforcement report. And again, over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Chair. This is the first of two substantive reports that we have to present to you today, and effectively we are looking at probably the one with the weightier issues in the first instance, with fire safety being on the agenda, with a couple of amber points highlighted as part of this review. Again, I had a very helpful meeting with the chair earlier in the week, and there was a couple of points of detail which I will add into some of my presentation in relation to this. The first point that isn't explicit in the report, which we do make mention of in the background, is in relation to a more hybrid programme which has been carried out over the course of the year. From our observations and from discussion and review of evidence along with staff, we've noted in relation to this that in terms of the ultimate outcomes of the review, reviews that there was no notable difference between more of an on-site or a hybrid approach. Indeed, actually, the hybrid approach is one which is looking to be more widely utilised going forward, because it allows a different breadth and frequency of review to take place, enabling that going forward. That's hence why we're a little bit silent on that one, because it wasn't one where we particularly had an additional comment to make in terms of improvement. In terms of, though, the overall conclusions to the report, we have noted a number of elements of good practice in terms of a solid, well-developed framework that's well aligned to legislation and appropriate regular reporting that is ongoing. However, there are a couple of more significant matters of improvement that we do have to note. The first is in relation to a need for central oversight of training records, and indeed that is one where, when undertaking the work, we noted that in some instances those training records were effectively held on individuals' computers, and hence why we were unable to obtain definitive answers on those during the course of the work. Generally speaking, whether it was all of the detail was held perhaps at a local level, we would anticipate a need for some centralised record of at least progress with that training, and that's one of the key matters that we have in relation to that. And the other key point to draw to your attention is that in terms of a need for clarity and accessibility of the process around fire safety incidents, particularly related to the understanding of the general public. In terms of some of the more lower risk points on the required updates to procedures and guidance, the key point in relation to that, as we understand it, is a need to effectively do some consolidation of those points and bring those into fire safety enforcement procedures. So bringing both the remote audit approach into the overall documentation. I appreciate that might not have been quite as clear from the both the finding and the response from management there. And the final point, just to draw to your attention as a matter of clarity, is in relation to the work of the Continuous Improvement Forum, and their actions are to consider a number of different reports and various meeting minutes and performance returns, which is supported by relevant management information. Again, this is one where, as I normally would do in relation to these reports, would very much welcome any comments from management and then turn to committee members for any particular questions on either for ourselves or management in relation to the report.
Okay, Matt, thank you for that. Martin, have you taken on the task of providing a initial management response to both of these reports, actually?
Thanks, Brian. Martin Blunden, Chief Officer of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Matt, thank you for being the last person standing. Welcome to the committee. We'll be gentle with you as a result of that. I think one of the things I was probably slightly more disappointed with in the report, and it's a really good report if you look at it at face value, but actually I wonder whether there's a part missing in both of the reports that you're presenting today, which goes beyond the what are we doing in this current year, and actually joins some of the dots going back, particularly around the fire safety legislation report, and says if you connect the fatal accident inquiry on the Cameron House and actually connect that to the current legislation and our use of legislation, it would have been really interesting to see whether you thought, as the internal audit, that we had we were using the powers that exist within legislation in Scotland to ensure that, yeah, I can see you can see where I'm going with this. We are using the legislation correctly and effectively, and actually whether there are any barriers to us using the legislation to its full extent. For example, if you compare where we are as a single service with services in England, we haven't undertaken any prosecutions in all the years that we've been a single service. And actually, with the size and scale of Scotland and the challenges that we have around fire safety legislation, it would have been interesting to have your view in terms of added value as to where you thought we could be. And I think that's the bit that's missing. So please don't think that I'm dissing what is a very they're very encouraging reports, but I think there's a bit beyond where you've got to that could add significant value to us as an organisation.
Yeah, very good point. Matt, you want to respond?
If I may, I think that's a very fair statement, Martin. I understand exactly where you're coming from, and it's one where I would probably ever so slightly rein back from the way that you've presented that, Martin. Hopefully you'll appreciate my reasons why for this. It's one where it would be difficult to make a judgment on whether you had used them to their fullest and completest extent. We would probably be able to make a reasoned judgment on whether it was appropriate usage, and that's my ever so slight caveat to that. All of that said, and I'm sure you appreciate the reasons why I say it in that way. That said, I think your comment is very fair, and it's certainly one where in future work we can certainly consider using that. And indeed, one of our other bodies which also has the ability to hold various different bodies to account, and I will say who they are because there's no hidden agenda on this, and that's the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. They have certain legislative powers which they can utilise, and indeed when doing reviews that are relevant and talk about the consideration of the use of their powers, it's something which is increasingly on our agenda, and we are happy to comment on that. We might need to just think about how we scope some of the audits to make sure that we do cover those off appropriately, but we'll certainly bear that in mind for future work, and very happy to do so.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Paul.
Thank you for that. Very interested in this report. Couple of issues I wanted to raise. One on the management, the issue about the public-facing website and the way that you're recording reports. I was quite concerned to see that, and I was pleased by the management action that you're going to review that and consider how that. To me, that seems to be quite a significant matter, and I was almost surprised that was only at the level it was and wasn't a more serious thing. Obviously, it's important for public confidence. It's also important intelligence for what we're doing. So I just wanted to comment briefly on that. I don't know whether Matt wanted to say anything more about that particular one.
Matt?
Just making sure I'm off mute there so I can respond appropriately. I suppose really the fundamental question for us on this, and there may be something in there for management as well, is the rating that applies to that, Paul. And from my perspective on this one, there is almost always a little bit of a judgment call on where we might grade something in relation to this. And for me, this is one where, without being too colloquial in almost kind of how to describe this, I almost think of the grade 4 actions of more akin to the kind of things which would be immediate significant risk of almost failure of a major part of the organisation for a grade 4 red item. And for me, this doesn't quite meet that criteria with that in mind. That said, we do see this as an important matter, and that's why we put that at the high risk exposure, which is kind of categorised later on in each of the reports as an absence or failure of key controls that create significant risk within the organisation. We think that's an appropriate level to grade that at. I think there was maybe one or two other points there that you did say that might warrant comment from management though.
Thank you for that, and I understand that. I'm just sort of wanted to draw attention to it at this committee, and I should have said that I'm Paul Stollard and I'm a board member. The other thing that I wanted to comment on, if I might, is to agree completely with what Martin said. I thought this is inevitable when you're doing an internal audit review of this function, but I thought it raises some questions which might actually go beyond internal audits. And as a new board member, I wanted to ask, have I seen and forgotten, or are there relevant papers from a chief inspector's review of this area? Is there an overlap here with what's going on there?
Yes, Paul. I was going to invite Robert to perhaps offer comment on this, but this is an appropriate point to do so. Robert.
Thanks, Chair. Robert Scott, Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Yeah, the Inspectorate have carried out a thematic in relation to fire safety enforcement in the past. I can't quite remember what year it was, obviously prior to my appointment. There are similarities, I think, within the findings, and also I thought that Matt's work would actually be very useful for us as we move into the process of service delivery area inspection, because as you know from the strategy day where I presented my thoughts on how we would move forward with that inspection, one of the themes that I'm particularly interested in is prevention activity. So I think, you know, Matt and I would hopefully have a chance to chat about the work that he's done and some of the data that he interrogated, so that we can ensure that we're on the same track when we're carrying out our inspection of service delivery area activity in relation to prevention. Off the top of my head, I can't quite recall exactly how many recommendations or what they were within that fire safety enforcement thematic, Paul, but yeah, it is available on our website should the board members wish to have a look at it.
That was my feeling as well. There was something, but I couldn't remember it. I just think the issue Martin raised is a really interesting one, and I think it's something that deserves really sort of almost like a tripartite review with internal audit, yourself, if I may, as you're suggesting, Robert, and also the internal management.
Yeah, and I'm completely open to that kind of relationship and that kind of discussion taking place. Obviously, the inspectorate has to remain independent in its approach to audit, has to be independent. But yes, as I said right at the start of my appointment, relationships are key, and the relationship between the inspectorate and internal audit is a very important part of that.
Thank you, Brown.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think that was a really good and interesting line of discussion, and Ali has just confirmed, I think, that report, Robert, raised 12 recommendations on the subject. So it certainly feels as if there's an opportunity for, as you describe it, Paul, a tripartite discussion. And I wonder if we could take as an action to have that discussion and just provide, you know, a reasonably brief kind of verbal report back to the next meeting of the committee.
Certainly happy to commit to that from my side, Chair.
Thanks, Robert. And I don't hear any dissent, so let's take it as that. And as I say, it's just a verbal update back to the next meeting to help join those dots. Leslie, you wanted to come in.
Yes, thanks very much, Brian. Like Paul, I was a bit taken aback by seeing this finding. I welcome the management action, and I welcome the early due date for delivery, and I'm hoping, well, I very much hope that we complete the action by that date. I note on page 5 of the report the fire safety revised fire safety enforcement procedure is currently in draft. Does that draft address the issue of recording of all fire safety related complaints? Just to double check. Do we know?
Do we know? No one is offering a response. Okay. So could I ask for that point to be picked up and the response circulated to the committee, please?
Yeah, or I'm happy to wait for the update on a implementation of management actions at the next meeting.
Okay.
I just, yeah, it's fine. Okay. More importantly, perhaps, is how we ensure implementation of the revised recording of issues coming from the public, because it's really quite hard to know if a procedure to record things coming in is being implemented consistently, because if things aren't picked up, they just aren't picked up. You never actually know they're there. And I don't, it's not a strictly relevant parallel, but it is a parallel, the incidents of the car crash in central Scotland that had been reported to the police, but that report went nowhere. So I'm interested in how we are going to check that the application is, that the procedure is being applied consistently across Scotland, and whether, for example, PIs and benchmarking would be part of that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Leslie. And I was just checking the date of our next meeting, which is the 30th of March. So, I mean, there's been one or two questions raised, and I think the most effective and efficient way to deal with those is simply to receive a slightly fuller update on the implementation of the recommendations at our next meeting. So if we are content with that.
Okay, so we'll postpone the discussion to how we're going to ensure consistent implementation of the revised policy until then. Is that what we're saying?
I was anticipating that there may need to be some kind of thought goes into exactly how the recommendation is implemented, but Martin or others, if you're in position now to respond to that, please do. Martin.
No, I think I'd probably, if I could tweak your language slightly, Leslie, I think it's how we can provide assurance that the implementation of the policy has been acted, as opposed to you ensuring it's been enacted. That's a management action as opposed to a board action. I provide that assurance to you. I do wonder whether this drops into Robert's area of business as well, in terms of something flagged up, and actually that then follows through. But I will take that off table if I can, please, Chair, and have a discussion, and then come back and provide an update.
Okay, yeah, I think I thought I had been asking how you were, but my tendency perhaps to say we all the time, just because that's the way I work and I'm kind of collegiate working, might have influenced you there. Absolutely aware it's a management action, and it's how is management then going to ensure consistency. I welcome hearing more about that. I had a second point, Brian.
Yes, please.
I had actually a couple more points. I wanted to pick up on Martin's point with benchmarking of other services. I think that would have been helpful, and it does raise with me the question of how we, the audit committee and management, separately and together, how we look at the terms of reference for different internal audits, because that is, to me, where that point could have been picked up. I know that there is an ongoing. I know that management approved the terms of reference. For me, this particular instance has raised that question again as to whether the audit committee should see terms of reference before the work continues. That one, I think I would like to leave sticking to the wall. Perhaps we can pick it up in a workshop. But just to say, that is where I think this point could have been picked up, and it would have been useful to have picked it up at that stage. My last point is regarding the training records. So I note the point and absolutely support the recommendation and the management action. But I just wanted to ask Matt, of the training records that you were able to look at, did all the FSEOs have the requisite training to do the job?
So just a bit slow getting off mute there. It's not mulling over or anything of that nature on that one. Yes, the ones that we did get access to the full records, we did find that they had the appropriate training as we were exploring.
That's excellent. Thank you for clarifying that point. Thank you. Thanks, Chair.
Okay. Sorry, if I may just maybe clarify one point that might just kind of address that if and where there's a similar question going forward. It's probably a slight style of reporting where we tend to report by exception. So if there is something which we are silent on, that tends to mean it is absolutely fine. Probably worth you asking that question just for clarity if and where needed, but that's why we're silent on that matter, Leslie, and for other members of the committee.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Matt. Thank Leslie. That was a much fuller discussion than I had anticipated, but a very good discussion. If I can just sort of highlight a couple of points in terms of where that has taken us to, an action point for the inspector, the auditors, and the service to just get their heads together, just to consider joining the dots there, and linked to that, we'll receive a verbal update on progress on the implementation of the recommendations at our next meeting. I think the broader point that Martin sort of began with, I think Matt really laying down the challenge about looking at the opportunities to look more broadly, look externally, join the dots, however you care to describe it. But in essence, it's about looking for opportunities around adding value. And I certainly, we talked about this the other day as well, so I would certainly take that as an action from today. And when we receive the draft plan in March, it would be helpful to see some sort of commentary just round about how you might anticipate doing that, because obviously it's going to be on a case-by-case basis. But even if there's a discipline that is part of agreeing terms of reference, for example, that might be a helpful way to proceed. And just picking up your point, Leslie, on the committee seeing draft terms of reference, I think we need to be careful not to take too strict a view on that. I think there may be occasions, and remote working, for example, was one of them, where the committee did see draft terms of reference, but ordinarily that would not be the case. But what I suggest we do is we've got a committee workshop next month, and I think it would be a really important matter to pick up and discuss then in that session. Okay, thank you for that. Then takes us on to the second internal audit report, which is learning and development. And again, back to you, Matt.
Thank you, Chair. With in mind that there is lower risk issues highlighted in this report, we might be in a slightly quicker review and commentary on this report. I'll take it as read that Martin's earlier comments covered both reports in terms of the consideration of added value, so I won't kind of particularly labour that point, but very much taken as read for consideration in future work. In terms of the overall outcome of this review, it's overall very good performance that we found in relation to this area, with really good kind of content development in terms of the leadership programme and use of financial investment schedule along with the commodity strategy to kind of get the finances of this highlighted. We had a couple of small areas for improvements, which is really about the processes around collating and communicating the feedback in relation to the programme and programmes that have been undertaken. We do see that as more of it's more completing that circle as much as anything and making sure that people are aware of that, hence why that's reasonably low risk in terms of the points that we've highlighted. The one other thing that I would wish to draw to your attention, again, this is one which from discussion with Brian earlier in the week maybe wasn't quite as clear in relation to how this is articulated in the report, and that's in relation to how the overall consideration of the success of the programme has been considered. The evaluation report is a key part of that, which notes the progress and performance of the training programme and does consider the objectives, targets and indeed financial performance in relation to that. So we're comfortable that that is analysed, and then it's just this almost kind of day-to-day individual elements of the programme for the individual sitting those and being part of that training programme, which is the remaining gap. But do emphasise that is low risk point that we do have in relation to that. At that point, I would very much welcome comments from management or indeed questions from committee members in relation to the report.
Okay, thanks, Matt. Martin, any specific points you would like to add? No. Okay, in that case, I'll just open it up to questions. Leslie?
Thanks, Matt. And it's obviously great to see the great work being done here. On evaluation, the evaluation recommendation refers to what we would used to call happy sheets at the end of training, I think. And that's an important, very important aspect of evaluation. Did you look at or get a sense of the extent to which the training undertaken was making a difference to on-the-job performance, kind of the higher level evaluation of training?
Certainly from the consideration of the progress report, yes, we did see that that was considered as part of that, and we didn't identify any particular issues in relation to that matter. So it's more the making sure the opportunities there. As you say, I've never heard the term happy sheets before, but I recognise the theme behind it, and it might be one that I use a little more regularly. But no, there wasn't any particular issues in relation to the matter you've queried.
If I can maybe just follow up on that, and perhaps a question for you, Martin, in terms of the overall effectiveness of the leadership development programme. From your perspective, have you seen the benefits filtering through?
Thanks, Brian. Yes, I have seen the benefits filtering through. I think one of the things, and Matt, taking it as read, the earlier comment applies to this particular report as well. I think one of the things that I would like to see connected up is how does the leadership training program impact on the culture of the organisation? So actually, it's almost that going beyond where you would naturally do the. I smiled at Leslie's happy sheet because I can recognise those very much from previous existence. What's the real term impact in the organisation? Yes, management training is great, leadership training is great, but actually, how is it changing how the organisation operates, and how does the leadership training contribute to the strategic objectives that we've set out as an organisation in our previous strategic plan, in the new strategic plan? How does it meet the ambition of the 5 framework? So that's the additional benefit, I think, would be really helpful. So we start to connect the dots. I'm going to use that horrible phrase. We join the various strands of work that's ongoing, and actually you provide almost a 360-degree internal audit when you're looking at the particular area, as opposed to just looking at that in its not on its own, but it's a little bit more in an isolation than actually I would like.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry, Matt. I thought I saw you reaching to respond, but I think that's a very good point. And I think, Matt, another pointer of how, in terms of looking more broadly and adding value, and to be fair, you know, the onus is on everyone who's involved in developing terms of reference. It's not just all down to the auditors, but where the auditors, I think, can add particular value is to draw upon your experience of other sectors, other organisations, and experience of seeing instances where value is being added. So I think that's been a useful kind of capping off of that part of this discussion. If there are no further points on this report, and I don't see anyone, thanks very much for that. And we'll move on now to the progress report on the implementation of internal audit recommendations. And again, Matt, this is down to you. I wonder if you could say something specifically about the meeting that took place on the 12th of January, which is referenced at 4.1 of the paper.
No, absolutely, Chair. And for me, this report is probably less about the individual line by line and more about some of the kind of themes which sit within this. I will probably come to that meeting in due course. There's a couple of bits I would just maybe wish to draw to attention just before hitting that particular point. The kind of overall position that we have in terms of follow-up actions is one where there's a relatively high number of actions which do remain, but with that said, there is an overall downward trend, and I will comment on the position since our appointment almost 2 years ago, and there has been that kind of general downward trend in relation to that. We did meet with management on the 12th of January to discuss particularly the approach that would be used to the longer outstanding actions, and that really for me sits on those that sit from the 3 reviews that cover water planning, fraud risk management, and I'm now forgetting my third of those. Just let me just get my notes up.
Performance management.
Performance management. Thank you, Brian. And those are probably the 3 which are probably the longest persistent ones which have looked at that. As we discussed at our previous meeting, there are a number of factors which do fit in as some of the rationale and reasons for these, but probably more concerning, both at previous meeting and in discussion with management, is the overall timeline extension to those recommendations, and indeed the number of iteration changes to the timescales which sat within each of those. If I can maybe just kind of draw your attention to those as 3 separate audit reviews, because I think from my perspective, that is a slightly different consideration of each one of those. Performance management, I think, despite having a little bit of extended timelines, I'm probably about as comfortable as I can be without them being completely closed off, that not only are those extensions reasonable, but there is good chance of those being closed out for the next meeting. Fraud management probably is a little bit more of a mix, with the recommendations overall being extended fairly significantly and probably beyond what we would typically expect. But there are some implications in terms of systems implementation and a need for that to be impacted in the way that they resolve. And water planning probably has some of those same considerations, also linked to systems implementations. But again, I'm probably a little bit clearer on the overall systems implementation, how that will impact on those being delivered. What effectively has been agreed in principle with management is for us to jointly consider those 3 reviews, and indeed future older reviews going forward, to ensure that they are periodically considered for ongoing relevance, and agree any additional changes to how those may be implemented if and where relevant. That's one where we're not in that position of saying we have an absolute categoric, this is our pathway forward in all instances, but that's effectively kind of where we are in terms of that kind of overall progress and implementation. That said, I think there have been some very encouraging matters which have been undertaken alongside management to move these forward, some of which you will be well aware of, including additional challenge of management in terms of the timescales to implement. Because when we first joined you as your internal audit provider, we noted that there were probably some slightly overambitious timescales that were being noted. And to be completely frank, it's one where we need management to slightly push back in terms of if something's achievable, and not feel under pressure that it just has to be delivered to a short timescale, particularly if there are a number of steps that need to be gone through. That, alongside all of our reports now being presented to SLT, we feel that that's been a very valuable contribution in terms of giving additional interdependencies and oversight to SLT to be able to comment on those matters, to ensure that we're well aware of that and management are, to give the best chance of those follow-up actions being implemented to the timescale set out. All of that said, I do see this as an improving picture, and I do also see it as one where the engagement that we are having with management is positive, but I think it's recognised from both sides there is still further work to do, and we are very keen to work collaboratively on that matter. Before opening up for questions, Brian, I would maybe suggest them if there's any further comments either from Martin or from John's going to come in and just add a little bit of flavour, because John, I know we've talked about this extensively over recent weeks, and there may be some bits particularly that of more some of the internal processes that maybe I've not kind of reflected to its fullest extent.
Okay, thanks, Mark. John, you want to come in?
Yes, thank you, Brian. The point I wanted to add is that we've also been looking at kind of process terms. What are we doing around our process for this, and in particular where actions are perhaps delayed and there is repeated changes to the timelines. And I just wanted to highlight, for example, in the water planning, and we took that to our good governance board. We asked the relevant action owners to come and present where they were with the action, how they were going to get a clear path to clearing it. So, if you like, part of an escalation process to put some more rigour around it, and also to demonstrate that we were seeking conclusion on that audit action. I think the other thing that came out from the discussions with myself and Matt were around, let's be clear that where perhaps an action has got a consideration which says says, oh, well, we're waiting for something else to happen. An example would be that we have an audit action that links to the PTFA, the kind of people training finance and asset system, but that's in the future, and you know, that could be a fairly long period of time. We therefore have to address the internal control matter, which was highlighted by the actual audit, and therefore let's go back and make sure that we are addressing that even in the interim, before we then put in the final solution. So I think it's about understanding the process a little bit better, knowing where we should be delving a little bit more deeper in escalation, and also making sure that as part of that management review, we're going back to say, well, hang on a minute, let's just make sure we can close off that internal control. So a really useful discussion between Matt and myself around the process, around all this, and how we can make that improvement in terms of those internal audit actions. So hopefully that gives you some flavour, committee, in terms of what we've been doing in that area.
John, that's very helpful, and if I was a suspicious person, I would say you've had a look at my questions, but I'm sure that's not the case. Thanks very much for that, Matt, and to John, which I think really does provide a substantive point to some of the more strategic matters. Other questions on the paper? Murray.
Yeah, sorry, I'm pushing the wrong button. There are three relatively minor points, and I don't think I said my name earlier on, so apologies, Mary Wiley, board member. I suppose in the first one, there's a wee bit about, it's how am I being assured that in the complications of issues connected to COVID, that we are not seeing other issues going masked by the issues around COVID. And I guess for me, although there's bits and pieces of assurance throughout what Matt said and throughout what John said, is the assurance robust enough? I guess if the committee members feel that's the case, I'm not fully convinced, because we went into the COVID situation with problems around timelines. And one of the other points I was going to raise is I'm looking at this. There's an awful lot of March 22 deadlines in here that don't seem realistic. I think that is still an ongoing issue, but I can't at the moment judge about, is that still an ongoing issue that has just simply not been resolved or been possible to resolve because of the COVID situation, or do we actually have a significant and ingrained issue here about timelines? And to be frank, I don't feel assured from anything that Matt or John have said that it sufficiently meets my levels of concern. So, but that's one example. I think that there are others. So I feel as though there's an element, I guess I'm flagging it up, Matt, maybe from my perspective, I feel I need to be assured that there are not larger scale issues that are potentially going unnoticed, even by our management team, as a result of the COVID pressures. And I'll leave that out there. That it's a question that's in my head, as it were. We'll come to whatever that means, I guess. The other thing then I was going to release, for me, the RAG status element makes this difficult, and I don't know if it's just me who's finding that difficult. When I look through this and I see the completed percentage, and then I look at the colour, and then I look at the deadline, and I'm a bit like, well, is this realistic to say that this is on course to meet that deadline? But because of the way that it's ragged, it gets ragged as amber after 3 revised date. Well, most of these are sitting at more than 3 revised dates, so they're automatically amber. So I have absolutely no idea. Say if we take for page 65, 1B and 2B, they are sitting at 90%. Now, are they realistically going to meet that time frame? Very possibly, but they're sitting at amber, which makes me hesitant to think, are they actually going to progress? I don't know if I'm just giving too much thought to this, and possibly I am, but that concerns me, I suppose. So it's a bit, that ragging automatically is amber after 3 days. How useful is that in terms of interpreting what's here from a committee perspective is a query to some extent to my colleagues, I suppose, more than anybody else. And then I am just going to raise it. There's an awful lot of March 22 deadlines in here, January 22 deadlines in here. I have some significant doubt that we will be able to meet, and it's how much is that being reviewed, and some of it Matt you've already covered. So that wasn't necessarily a question, Brian, but just an insight into the mess that is going on in my head when I read this paper. So my apologies to you all for trying to interpret that.
No, I don't think you need to apologise at all. I think they were all very good and valid points, and your point I'll just pick up on before I have Leslie and Matt come in, is I also struggle with the amber status after 3 revised deadlines. It just, I don't see why one follows the other. But if we are using this document as a means of scrutiny, so that process, if it's not entirely fit for purpose, we need to do something about. So I'll come back. I'm sure we will come back to a lot of these points, and I want to draw some of these things together when I say something. But in the meantime, Leslie and then Matt. Thank you.
Yes, I think it's helpful to have the number of the revised date, 3rd, 4th, 5th revised date, and having that flagged in red. And I agree with what you're saying, Vary, that if something is on course to meet the revised date, then it should be green. But I can't follow the logic that went behind the current system, so it may be that we're missing something. Again, this may be one for the ever-lengthening workshop agenda. I just wanted to say I agree with Vary. I interpreted this report as, well, my take on this was 2-3 years ago, we had an issue with over-ambitious dates and gilding the lily, or gold plating the management recommendations. I felt we made really good progress in that. COVID seems to have thrown us out. No, COVID has thrown us out because of a whole variety of good reasons. The pressures on the organisation. Absolutely, I understand that. I just would hate to see us not making further progress on addressing the actual recommendation, the control objective, and setting realistic timescales and meeting them. I really don't want in a year's time to be sitting looking at a report that has a raft of 3rd, 4th, 5th revised dates. I really welcome what you said, John, about going back to revisit the original control objective. And I don't know how we capture that, but I think that's a really key point. That was all I wanted to say, Brian. Thank you. Thanks, Leslie. Matt.
It's really helpful to get the perspectives both of Mary and Leslie and others here, and in many respects this echoes a lot of the conversation that John and I have. I do very much recognise the point that Mary makes in terms of the clarity of the reporting of the red, ambers and greens, and in some respects that's one which we need to consider the key message we're trying to convey in terms of that ag status, and some of that is at the minute caught a little bit between the position which is an undesirable one at the moment where we do have that significant tail, and one where we want to get to in more of a steady state, where once we are in a steadier state, actually having things which are significant number of revisions, even if they are on track for the revised date, flagged and highlighted to you, is potentially a helpful thing. At the moment, there's probably too much almost white noise along with some of this for that to be as useful as it could be at the moment. So do fully recognise that point and will be very much considered in terms of where we go to with that report. And I will say to some extent we may make some changes in terms of the formatting as to how some of that is presented to be as useful as it can be in relation to all of that. The COVID kind of almost kind of elephant in the room question on this is one which we do encounter pretty much without exception across our client base. And I think it's absolutely right and fair to ask those questions, because in some respects, whether it is a COVID impact or whether it's something else, it's important to understand the distinction as to whether that's maybe an issue. But ultimately, the point here is looking at there was something which was agreed at a point in time to be the right thing to do. And if there has been impact by COVID, which is either taken attention away from management for potentially very good reason, I hasten to add, then it needs to be clear on whether a delay is because there are other priorities and therefore you have clarity and agree that that effectively is the way forward, or whether it's something which actually things have changed and therefore it may not actually be taken forward at all. There's a huge range of different options, and that's one of the things which John is taking away with others to explore in a more fuller extent from discussions which we've had. I can see, having mentioned John's name, he's now got his hand up as well, but I'll pause at that point.
Okay, thanks, Matt. John.
Yes, Chair. Listen, it was just to come back to Vary on her comment around assurance, etc. I certainly don't believe that it's unnoticed by management, far from it. I think in my role and what I've been doing with Matt is absolutely saying, look, we understand that these timelines may be challenging. We understand that the actions may be not getting progressed as quickly as we perhaps had imagined, perhaps, due to all things COVID. But the fact that we are having those active discussions to try and resolve those things and make sure we try and draw it to a conclusion, I do hope suggests that there is both intervention in terms of management and that we are actually trying to improve the process to make sure that we can clear off those audit actions. So I just wanted to make that point, Chair. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And Mary, did you want to come back in?
It's just a small point. Well, two things, I guess. The first is, I think the key issue here isn't a question of whether or not progress is being made, but rather, are we realistically assessing the timeframe and providing a context back to the board then that is what's going to happen. I mean, there's a variety of things we pull out from the report to try and demonstrate that point. This isn't about rapidity of getting the action done, but rather that we are managing the process appropriately. And in that point then, Brian, I am going to do an incredible injustice in the example I'm about to use, and it's not one I think is the case. But as a board member sitting outside of this looking at the top, the issue to some extent with seeing revised dates to the extent that we do and still sitting here year or so, 2, 3, 4 years later with still this ambitious deadline issue. The question that you almost have to ask yourself as a non-exec is, do we have competency in understanding how to manage workloads within our management structures? Now, I don't think that we do have a huge issue around that, but when you're presented with these issues, it does make you dig and query those questions. And I think it's a question of that this is where, to some extent, it has an issue then on the COVID situation, because if we can't assess how long it takes to undertake tasks competently within reasonable timeframes, taking account of pressures of our workforce, how are we then able to make competent decisions around workforce planning in emergency situations like COVID? Now, I am doing a disservice and an unjust observation in terms of linking those things up, but it doesn't take an awful lot to go from A to B in that circumstance. Yeah. And that's kind of where I'm coming from. I think we're not, I think to be fair, that the staff that we have are incredible. I don't think they're doing themselves justice in terms of what's coming through here, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And as Martin said previously, what you're doing is drawing strands together here. That length of discussion on this topic does not surprise me, and indeed I'm encouraged by all of the discussion. At one level, the outstanding recommendations that are bothering us are relatively few in number, but the truth is that the progress towards implementation is painfully slow. And what we've been talking around are the reasons for that. Is it overly ambitious target dates? I suspect it is. Is it lack of capacity? I suspect it is. Is it a lack of priority that's being given to the task? I suspect it's a bit of that as well. So it's a bit of a complex picture. But the key point for me is if we accept that this is not in a place where we want it to be, what do we do about it? And certainly from this committee's perspective, the key point for me, and was going to be my key line of inquiry, was around what does management do in terms of oversight of the implementation of recommendations, which really goes back to John's point about process. And I wonder if it would be a helpful addition to this report in future if that narrative around management's considerations could be added to the front end of this paper. So for the key recommendations that remain outstanding, that there's some commentary that management have looked at that, have considered it, and have concluded whatever it may be. I think the other substantive point that John highlighted as well is, where there is a delay, that there is still a control weakness. And interestingly, the example that John picked up, that things are being moved to a new system that's being developed, well, that just pushes the addressing of that control weakness further and further to the right. So I really would welcome in that narrative something that talks about the original control weakness and what is being done to address it in the interim, whether that's a workaround or whether it's some other interim solution. I think that's hugely important. I don't want to labour the point, because it's quite easy to look at this report and really kind of pick holes in the length of time things have been outstanding. But just for my own interest, I look back, and this is in relation to water planning, the 4 recommendations on water planning. And I was interested to understand how the state of completeness has moved over a period of time. Now, I only had access back to the papers for the Audit Committee going back to October 2020. But from 2020 to this report today, there has been no change in the percentage complete for 4 recommendations. And I suspect if I were to go back and do that for some of the others, it would be a similar picture. So, you know, this has unfortunately become a fairly kind of static position that's being reported. And I think we need to take away from this discussion, you know, ideas for how we can improve upon it. And I think, Matt, from an internal audit, you know, critical assessment of the position, I think you've been helpful today in explaining perhaps more clearly whether you're content or not content, whether you're satisfied with the reasons being given. And I wonder whether that needs to be perhaps a little bit more explicit. But all of that for me means that we need to think perhaps afresh about the format, the content of this paper coming to the next meeting. And I would be grateful if thought could be given to that in the interim, so that come the March meeting, we perhaps can see a different format of paper with different emphasis and perhaps showing a slightly different position at that stage. Okay, that's great. Well, thank you all very much for that. I appreciate the openness of that discussion. So thank you. So that concludes the session on internal audit, and it now takes us into the independent audit and inspection action plan, which, Mark, that's over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Mark McAteer, Director of Strategic Planning, Performance and Communications. So in terms of the report this morning, just to draw attention to committee members, you've got at Appendix A the overview of the dashboard for all the internal work that we're doing against the external inspection reports, all of which come to you for detailed scrutiny, as you know, on a cyclical basis. This morning it's the Audit Scotland report due for some scrutiny, and I'm pleased to say that of the 36 actions, 35 are now complete. The one outstanding action relates to the RDS, and since the written update for the report was produced, we've now arranged a meeting with the Executive Council members from the FBU. I believe it's next week that will take place, to try and bottom out now the issues on RDS terms and conditions, and I'm sure that Martin and Liz Barnes will update the board fully following that meeting. So with that, Brian, happy to take any comments, observations from committee members.
Okay, I mean, we've seen this report a number of times now, but any comments? We have only one now outstanding recommendation. No. Robert, you would like to come in?
Thanks, Brian. Really quick point, Mark, easy one to fix, but on page 83, Appendix B, it titles HMFSI Audit Scotland. I don't think it is HMFSI, I think it's purely Audit Scotland. I think I've asked that question before, but can HMFSI be removed? Because it confused me slightly, which is not difficult to do. Thank you.
I'll get that sorted. Apologies.
Yeah, and I think 3 strikes and you're out, Mark, because you have raised that before, Robert. So we'll look with interest at the next report. Okay, thanks very much for that, Mark. And presumably, well, subject to FBU, March may be the final time we see this, do you think?
I wouldn't like to prejudge the meetings that are coming up, Brian. That's all that I'll say.
Understand. Okay, thank you very much for that. And then that takes us on to the external audit part of the paper. And Caroline, you've got the report before us, but it's only for information. So could you just perhaps explain why it's come to us?
Of course, Brian. So Caroline Jameson, Senior Manager, External Audit. So the paper's presented for information just to wrap up our finalisation of the work over the 2020-21 financial statements. As committee members will remember, at the previous ARAT meeting in October, the work wasn't quite finalised, and so this report is just provided to allow members to understand the final position. So it just confirms that we issued an unmodified or unqualified or clean, depending as to where people have come from in terms of learning opinion speak, audit opinion in December. So it was issued on the 15th of December. And it also confirms that there were 4 errors which remained uncorrected within the financial statements. One being in relation to the uniforms accounting that we discussed at length in the previous meeting, 2 surrounding legal cases within pensions balances, and 1 which is in relation to the services share of errors identified by the local government pension fund auditors. So it's something that other firms have identified and we've taken your share of. And then it also just confirms that there's no disclosure misstatements were identified within the final set of the financial statements. So I didn't really plan to say much more unless anybody had any questions.
No, that's great, Caroline. And just before I invite questions, I know it's covered in the paper, but in terms of the external audit and your position, are you content on all outstanding matters, or is there anything that felt in any way a loose end for you?
No, content matters, and we'll pick up sort of the recommendations we raised as part of the planning for next year's audit.
That's great. Thank you for confirming that. Any questions for Caroline? No, well, perhaps predictably, given the historic nature of this report. So excellent. Thanks, Caroline. Thank you very much for that. And then that takes us on to what is a related report, part of the external audit for 2021, included a fairly comprehensive wider scope review, which resulted in a number of recommendations being made. And we now have an action plan, and we now have progress against that action plan. And I think, John, you will talk to this item.
Yes, Chair. Thank you. So, as the committee will recall, we seen the Deloitte audit dimensions and best value report and recommendations, otherwise known as the kind of wider scope audit previously. There was 28 recommendations that were made by Deloitte, and management actions were agreed. In terms of those external audit actions, just wanted to highlight that Deloitte will review those actions as part of their interim work going forward. So they're not reviewing it on a kind of quarterly basis, if you like, but it will come to this committee on a quarterly basis just to show progress. So in terms of the overall progress report, and this is the first progress report since we've agreed it, I will provide this report to the committee on a quarterly basis. At 3.4, one recommendation you will recall at 1.7 was not accepted, and therefore that is concluded. And at 3.5, recommendation 3.2 has been completed. And in terms of the 3.6, the action owners have reviewed their progress, and revised dates for 3 actions have been recommended. And I guess my thought process on that is that people have hopefully looked at the plan and made sure that they were therefore being realistic and therefore applying those revised dates. And you will recall that myself, I had looked at the actions, and I had suggested I wanted to revise some of the dates against mine, so those had been included previously, and this is the other action owners coming through and saying, look, we just need to be a bit more realistic in our dates. And that probably links back to the points that Barry has made already around the internal audit actions, so I'm hoping that that would be welcomed by the committee. In terms of the detailed progress report, it's included at Appendix A, and there's also a summary dashboard included at Appendix B, and I open it up for questions from the committee.
Okay, thanks, John. And just to say, I mean, I like the presentation of this. It's detailed enough to give us what we need to know, and it's relatively easy to read as well. So thank you for that. Questions for John? No? Well, I can't let you off that lightly, John. Don't take this personal, but no, just in all seriousness, I do like the presentation of this. I just want to pick up a couple of things, and it's perhaps just that I'm not fully understanding some of the narrative. If I could draw your attention to recommendation 1.3, which is around the idea of essentially saying how much individual outcomes for the organisation will cost and how much funding is committed to it. And we have talked about this, and we have talked about the challenges of that. I just wonder, the deadline for this is 31 March 2023, but my understanding is that there will be an iterative process over the course of this coming year to try and develop a model for this that actually is practical and will add some value. And I wondered, in terms of articulating that, whether it might be helpful to think about some milestones that might be set out at this stage, just so that we can measure progress towards that endpoint. You don't have to respond, perhaps just maybe consider it as you go through that process. And then in terms of 1.4, it was just clarity. Again, it's a deadline of the end of March next year. Is there work that can be done, however, in relation to the 22-23 budget on this particular point, or is that the intention? It's just that I'm not reading it in the narrative.
Come back, Chair, on those points. Yes, I'm happy to look at some milestones in terms of that progress towards that final audit action. I guess my hope is that you will see some changes as we go through time in terms of what's being presented. I guess my thought process is, well, what can I get? What can I deliver today? What can I actually give you that actually would be helpful in offering additional transparency? And what will we need to have a bit more fundamental discussion around as to, well, actually, how will that help us to achieve that outcome in terms of budget to outcomes? Because I do feel that it merits discussion and debate so that we can get something that does actually give added value to the organisation. So there's a bit that says I can do something in the interim, but there's also a bit that says that I would like to make sure that we have enough time to develop something that is fit for purpose and as I say, gives that added value. In terms of the medium-term financial model, one of the you will see, or the committee or the board, sorry, should see at the board strategy day, the budget strategy for 22-23, and that will include the fact that we will give an indicative medium-term financial model for the next couple of years, just so that the board have a wider understanding as to the impacts of 22-23 and what that might mean in terms of future budgets, similar to what happens in terms of the capital programme. That will be further developed when we, as part of the Scottish Government, they are looking at setting a resource spending review, and that will be completed in May 22. And at that point, I will probably have a much more firmer view as to what that medium-term financial model looks like for the organisation. So you can start to see that there is things in track that will start to give us the information that the board and also this committee needs around the kind of financial matters. So hopefully that explains the position, Brian.
That's helpful, John. And of course, there's a read across back to our conversation in relation to the internal audit recommendations and the tracking of that. And I think what would be really helpful is in reporting this every quarter, is that box which says progress up to date is a changing narrative and talks about what it is we're trying to fix and what progress has been made to fix it. That's great. Just one final point, and it's on 2.1, the asset management strategy. And I thought I had recalled, I think in the context of a previous internal audit report, that it was the intention to have an interim strategy developed so as not to be tied purely to the timing of the SDMP project. Am I mistaken in that respect?
Chair, you're not. My understanding is that we are developing that or more detailed asset strategies behind the overall asset management strategy. So the fleet strategy, the property side or the estate side, and the equipment side, etc. Obviously, it has to be done in conjunction with the SDMP in terms of our understanding of that. But it's not going to be something that we're going to say we're wholly dependent on SDMP. So that work is continuing at the moment. There is a reflection there by the asset management team that are saying, look, there's a lot of detailed work that they are trying to do to make sure that they can come to a conclusion on it. In particular, they're looking at the risk of failure in and around our asset areas and looking at the asset backlogs and getting lots of detail working in and around that. So that was the reasoning behind the change to the date around that, Brian.
Yeah, I wonder if I could maybe just ask you or perhaps Ian just to reflect on the commentary on this particular point, just to provide that assurance that stuff, it does talk about stuff that's going on, but it didn't make specific reference to an interim strategy position. And as I say, I thought I could recall that having been an agreed position. But apart from that, John, thank you very much for this, and I'm sure we will spend some time. And just in the first couple of examples, that there are clearly other things that are being discussed at board level that will impact on this, and it will help, if you like, bring this document to life, knowing that there are those discussions which are relevant to it. So thank you very much for that. And if there's no further questions, that then takes us on to item 10 on the agenda, which is internal controls and the strategic risk register. And David, you're going to take us through this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, David Johnson, Risk and Audit Manager. The purpose of the report is to provide the updated strategic risk to the Audit and Risk Assurance Committee. Section 3.4 identifies the kind of discussions being held within the SLT in terms of the overall strategic risk, and a number of those assessments have been changed through that discussion, and then the supporting directorate risks. The remaining sections in 3.5 starts to pick up on some of the other independent changes within the appendices to the report, looking just to give that assurance to the committee that the review process in terms of kind of closing, amending, adding, etc. risks to the register is a continual process. The kind of separate meetings held with heads of function, the discussions now held at a DMT level are all kind of supporting the process to ensure that the actions are being undertaken with that report coming through. Section 3.6 relates back to one of the points in the action log, I think, from the last meeting, where in terms of the portfolio office, the alignment of registers was slightly out of sync, and they were using an older version of the directorate risk register. So we've now created a new template. Meetings have been held with the portfolio office to begin to kind of transition the old register into the new format, and that's underway. And it's also aligned to the work being undertaken by the head of the portfolio office in terms of reviewing the overall governance and programme. So it's to give assurance that in terms of reporting to the change committee, these reports will now be in a similar fashion, using the new Word document, which the intention is to kind of be a lot more transparent, and it's hopefully easier to see some of the controls and some of the progress being made against it. and I'll do my best to answer any questions you might have.
Okay, thanks, David. Questions for David? Mary, then Leslie.
Mine is the really easy question, and it's just for my own understanding, it's a 3.4.1, and it may be a question for John, I don't know, rather than David, but it was just under the strategic risk number 7 and increase of risk rating to number 16, as opposed to where it had been previously at 12, and that's due to obviously the increased challenges. Was there anything, one particular funding envelope issue that you could just remind me what it was particular? Is that for the current year or is that anticipated for future years?
Chair, if I could answer that, it was to do with the budget proposal that we have, in particular around capital and our understanding of our overall investment profile. So that was the reason for the increase in the risk rating.
Are you happy, Mary? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Leslie.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, David. Just wanting to ask, we've got a date for the discussion of risk appetite, which is the kind of missing element, I think, in the remaining missing element in all the outstanding work that you've done. Do we have a date for that to come to the strategy committee?
I think you meant a strategy day rather than strategy committee, unless we've got another one now. Yeah.
I did indeed mean strategy day and not strategy committee. Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, Kirsty, I see you have put your hand up. Do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, please. I'm trying to press all my buttons all at once. Yes, we do. I believe it's the next strategy day, so we'll be doing it within the next month. If it's not the very next one, it's most definitely the one after that. But I think it's actually this one coming in a week and a half's time.
It's probably career limiting to disagree with the chair in a public meeting, but I think it's the February one.
I'm very happy that I was only half right, but yes, it's an absolute priority and we've waited a long time for it. So February. Thank you, Brian.
Okay, thank you. Paul.
Just looking through the risk register as it stands, on the item on UFAS, does that predate the decision taken by the board to adjust that, or is that taking into account that decision?
Chair, if I can answer that, I don't have an answer for that. I would have to go back. I think the information contained within this current register was gleaned maybe the end of November, beginning of December.
Fine.
So there may be a kind of a time lapse between some of those decisions made.
Fine, thank you.
Would you like that one checked out, Paul, just to clarify?
I don't think we need to check it out particularly because that'll be picked up at the next iteration. I'd expect to see that change, that's all. It stood out as something that's not right.
Okay, thanks, Paul. Robert, you did have your hand up. Do you still want to come in?
Yeah, it was about a schoolboy question, to be honest. I should probably know the answer to this, but the board strategy days, are they public meetings or is it possible to invite observers? The issue of risk appetite is one that comes up in our current thematic on health and safety in an operational context. And I wondered if it would be useful for us to have a view on that, but perhaps it's a discussion we can have following your strategy day, given that they're closed sessions.
I think that would probably be appropriate, but I'll be corrected by Kirsty if she has a different view.
I think it's important that strategy days remain closed, but it would make absolute sense that the outputs from that day should be discussed with the inspector.
Yeah.
Completely respect that, Chair. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Paul, you still got your hand up, or is that just a legacy? Yeah, thank you. Okay, David, thanks again for this report and the immense amount of work that goes into it. What I would find, I mean, Mary raised the template and the RAG scoring in relation to the internal audit paper that we looked at earlier. And I think some of those points still apply. I think what would be really quite helpful is to have a key which defines the RAG rating, the status, the progress that's been made, because sometimes it's quite difficult to try and distinguish. And if I just look at it's on Appendix 1C, page 158 of the pack, page 15 of the actual report itself, that there are 3 risks on this page, all being shown as a end date of the end of March 2022, all showing as amber, but the percentage complete, I think, for one is 70, one is 10, and one is 25. And I'm just struggling to understand how these judgments have been arrived at. And in terms of our ability to scrutinise that, I don't really understand how we can do that terribly effectively. It's more a general point than specifically on those risks. Is there anything that you're able to offer by way of response?
I think by way of response, what we do have in the background is the initial start date, and then there's an ability to understand how long something has then taken to progress. It's for myself, I think what we do is have that discussion directly with the head of function. And I think where the other conversations in terms of internal audit have progressed, to be fair to myself, I think I'll have to progress that type of discussion in terms of risk. That where we are having either a delay in that progress, it's to have the intention of I think within the actual kind of core document, there is a comment section that individuals can make in terms of what have we still got left to do. And it's maybe within that section to give some additional assurance to yourselves and not just to ARAC but to all committees that how is that work progressing and what is still left to do. So that's a discussion I can have directly with the Directorate's chair and try and provide a bit more context around some of the information coming to yourself. Yeah,
no, that's helpful, David. And you know, as was said before, this is a developing system, and it would be odd if everything that needed to be sort of done was done right at the very beginning of that process. But for me, I guess the bit that I still struggle with is really understanding, and I think the way you described it, what has still to be done. And the presentation of the document, you know, it almost teases you to try and understand that. So we've got a current risk rating, and then we've got a target score, which is a proxy for risk appetite, so we can see in colour and numeric terms what needs to be done. We have a status column that again gives us a RAG rating and a percentage, which I think is intended to be a measurement to say what's needed and how confident are we to get to that point. But I just wonder whether in this sort of succinct form without supporting narrative, we're able to make, you know, as much sense of this as we really need to. Certainly from a scrutiny point of view, we need to understand, you know, what needs to be done, when is it to be done by, and are we on track? These are the things. And the other point which I find is difficult to be able to do that is there is a target rating, but is that the end of the calendar year? Is that the end of the financial year? Because at one point we did talk about all these target ratings being at the end of the financial year. And to be frank, I'm not sure whether that continues to be the case. But I don't need, again, I'm not addressing the point to a particular risk. It's more the process that we're using. So I wonder if you could, I'm happy for you to respond to that now, but I wonder whether maybe to take that away, because certainly from my perspective, understanding how far we need to go and are we going to get there is kind of key to the scrutiny and challenge that I would like to exercise. And I don't feel currently that on the face of the presentation, it's easy for us to assess that.
I can take that away, Chair, and have that discussion. I think in developing the register, we will continue to do so. It's trying to anticipate and it's trying to learn from the discussions we have here, and I think that's why that kind of RAG status in terms of the amber and the percentage was incorporated within it, to try and encourage the discussion with directorates and discussions through yourself, and also through the risk spotlight process. That where that additional assurance is needed, we build up the culture within the organisation that they know they're coming to executive boards and committees to provide that further analysis. But it's just for myself then, it's how I can be clearer in having these discussions with individuals, that we communicate that within the written part as well.
Yeah.
So it's part of the maturing of the framework, and I'll have a look at that, Chair. Yes.
I understand the ambition of cutting down the lengthy narrative that you might otherwise get in favour of a more simpler presentation, but I feel in a sense we've lost a bit of the quality of the presentation and not having enough narrative. But I'm quite happy to talk further about that. I think what will be really helpful when we do come to talk about risk appetite is that we not only talk about what we consider a risk appetite to be, but we also talk about how it would be applied in practice, which might give us a bit of an insight into how the presentation of this document might be extended. So again, as before, David, happy to have some offline discussion about my comments. And I know we're going to talk about the risk appetite workshop offline as well. So happy to feed into that. I mean, just before we conclude on this, the committee members sort of recognise my comments. Are you in agreement, or do you think I'm barking mad? Well,
I think I quite like the status column. I don't know, Brian. I think I am yet to fully 100% get my head round this setup, to be quite honest. And as we're going through this, I was making a mental note that for the next meeting, I really have to properly get to grips with this. But my review of the papers the other day before I came in here, I looked at it and I was comfortable with the columns, and I thought I had understood, what the target rating had referred to. I noticed that there are that not all the target dates are end of year, so I was relatively comfortable with the current status of the reports, albeit that I said I had a mental note to say I think I'm not quite 100% there in these. So that was kind of where I'm at on it. So I would be slightly uncertain about a further tweak to the presentation, certainly in relation to for this committee. But I suspect that I'm just not as far ahead as you are in terms of becoming fully au fait with this suite of reports.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, thank you for that. And Mary.
Putting aside that wasn't necessarily a mutually exclusive situation, Brian, you presented us with, I think I'm like Leslie, I'm still trying to get my head around a little bit. In my wee head, I'm conscious that I tend to like to see the summary of the risk, what that risk is assessed at, what the control mechanisms are, and how the risk then modifies as a result of that. But I'm really conscious as well, Brian, that I'm pretty sure for 4 years we've asked David to do one thing and then he's tried to modify it, and then we've asked him to try and take on board something else. So I had started little notes in my own head to some extent with the people committee relevant of what it was that I was meaning, and then I was going to try and track back. I think if we're asking anything more, it would be useful, if I'm honest with you, given that this aligns across more than just this committee, is to probably take this to a board discussion. And I think we need to get a settled position and request, because I might be being wrong, Brian, and I'm not disagreeing with what you're suggesting, because the RAG status thing for me should be an indication of how close we are to achieving the current target. I feel sorry is the word I'm trying to find a better way to put it for David and risk management a little bit in terms of what we've been doing. I don't know how to make that sound any more board languagey, but I do kind of feel sorry for him a wee bit on this.
No, and thank you for that. And I think that language is absolutely fine. And just for the avoidance of doubt, I'm not talking about tweaking the format. You know, I think the questions that I have posed is around how we use the format. You know, and actually this feels to me as if we need a bit of a development session where we can sit in a room with David and we can, you know, and this is perhaps something that the board can do, because you're absolutely right, this is not about one committee. It's not to say that the format is wrong. I think we're all acknowledging some difficulty in just fully understanding how we use the format. I don't think that in any way describes a fatal flaw in the system. I am exceptionally complimentary about the system, but I think we do need to have that greater awareness of how we use it. Martin, you wanted to come in.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate you clarifying that, because that's quite important. This is one of those really interesting ones that I use as the accountable officer, and then that you scrutinise. So actually, we've got to make sure it serves us both equally well. And I really appreciate the work that David's done on this, because it was 2 years ago that I asked him to start the work, or 2 years ago at Christmas, that I asked him to start the work to get us to a risk register that actually we could use and interrogate, and that provided some assurance and also some the ability to delve down into as much detail as we required under the layers throughout the organisation and through the directorate, so that we could actually track things from the bottom to the top, or the top to the bottom. So I'd really appreciate doing a little bit of development with you, so that you get what you need as a committee, but also it matches then with where I currently sit as the accountable officer, and we have that beautiful symphony of agreement in the middle. As for your first question, I couldn't possibly answer that in a public meeting.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Thank you. I'm sure you will later, but that's another story. Okay, thanks very much. I think what I will do is I'll take a note, because later on in the agenda we're asked the question whether there's anything we need to take forward to a board strategy or integrated governance forum. And given that we have one of the latter immediately after this, I'll raise it at that, if I may. Okay, that's great. Thank you very much for all of that discussion. And the last item on this part of the agenda is anti-fraud and whistleblowing, a verbal update. John.
Yes, Chair, thank you. So as Matt alluded to, that there is some investigation work. So what I have to do is report to the committee that there's been 2 separate potential frauds were notified to myself since the ARAC report, or the last ARAC report. I reported that both to Martin as the accountable officer and to Brian as the chair of ARAC. Our internal auditors, sorry, I should say that we then agreed that in terms of action that we felt it merited further investigation, and therefore we have asked our internal auditors, ASX, to investigate both those matters and provide a subsequent report to ourselves. I also, this item covers both fraud and whistleblowing, and the second item is with regards to whistleblowing. There was 2 complaints that were notified to myself, again, through the whistleblowing policy. Both complaints were investigated and actions were undertaken to resolve and also to respond to the complainants around those elements. And finally, I have to say that there has been a further complaint that I received on Tuesday, as a complaint through the whistleblowing policy. It feels like they're maybe coming like buses at the moment. So that complaint has come into my inbox, and today I've asked for that to be investigated, and we'll obviously hopefully bring that to a conclusion. So that was all I was going to say on the matter. If there's further detail that we perhaps want to discuss on any of those items, may I suggest that we have a discussion as part of the private session?
Yeah, I think that's very sensible, because I suspect people will have 1 or 2 questions, John, but we can pick it up in the private session. Martin, you still have your hand up, but is that from the previous?
Sorry, Brian.
Yeah, okay, good stuff. Thanks for that, John. Just 1 point of clarification, please. I did see, I think it was in the internal audit progress report or follow-up, that there is a revision to the whistleblowing policy, I understand. It's just clarity that will come back to the committee for scrutiny before it's finalised.
My understanding is the People Committee, it's an HR report, and I also noted that it was scheduled to be done by April 22, Brian.
Okay, I don't want to disagree with that, but whistleblowing policy is under the terms of reference for this committee. So perhaps we can reconcile that position offline.
Okay.
Okay, right, thank you very much for that. And that takes us then on to item 11, which is Robert's quarterly update. Robert.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning again, everyone. Robert Scott, Chief Inspector of Her Majesty's Fire Service Inspectorate. I will keep this as brief as I can, Chair. You've had the paper circulated and hopefully members have had a chance to look through that. Within the paper, it discusses the work that's been ongoing from the Inspectorate since we last met in October. In October, I advised that we were nearing the end of our local area inspection in the Argyll and Bute area. That report has since been published. It was published on Christmas Eve. I'm sure everyone got one in their stocking and enjoyed reading it with your turkey dinner. The report itself is fairly positive in tone, with 6 recommendations in total, 1 of which being national in context and the other 5 being local in context. As you know, the local area inspections are not laid before Parliament, but they are published on our website and they are shared with the LSO for that particular area and with the Chief Officer, and the actions from that are considered to be local and are progressed locally. The national action within that I believe will be considered by SMB and SLT, and then if an action indeed is to be put in place, it would come before either this committee or Service Delivery Committee. So that's the only one to be particularly interested in. And again, I think what we've found through this process is there is a degree of repetition, and some of the actions highlighted in Argyll and Bute have already been actioned in other local areas in the past, which again probably prompts my desire to change that process that we spoke about another time. In relation to local area inspections, I also advised that we had commenced the inspection of the Angus area of Scotland. Unfortunately, that had to be delayed as the restrictions around the Omicron variant came into force. And so we had been making pretty good progress on that. It's one of the smaller areas, as you know, with only 6 fire stations within it. But we had to halt that process in November as a result of some of the restrictions around 3 households meeting in the one place. I've now had permission from the service and Director of Operations to resume that inspection, and we will start in the beginning of February with only 2 fire stations left to visit. So we're still very confident that we'll conclude that process this financial year and have our report published in March of this year. Without giving anything away and without presupposing the final outcome of it, I've got to advise the board members that it's been very positive so far, a very positive experience, and particularly the engagement with the local authority members. We've met with the Chief Exec, the Provost and the leader of the Scrutiny Committee, as well as the leader of the Council, and all of those have been very glowing in their praise of the engagement with the service at that local authority area, which is always encouraging to hear when a national organisation is taking its responsibilities to engage locally very seriously. So it has been very positive in tone, and yeah, I have no reason to doubt that it would be a fairly positive report. It will be the last report that we publish in the format of local area inspections, as I have already spoken to you at the board strategy day and on other occasions. We are moving to the format of service delivery area inspections, and within those inspections we'll have a look at each of the LSO areas and the local authorities that lie within them. So we will still be paying respect to that local authority engagement, but it won't be at a local authority area, and for all the reasons that I've outlined before and don't really need to get into again. We're at the early stages of developing the format of that new inspection process. I had a meeting with my team yesterday to discuss the areas that we plan on inspecting and the data that would underpin any results that we wish to publish. And the sort of terms of reference that would go along with that type of inspection. It is very much a work in progress, and whilst we plan on beginning this inspection regime in April, it's unlikely that we're going to carry out the field work until somewhere around July or August, because we will be developing our processes, we will be developing those terms of reference, and we plan on engaging with the service and indeed various board members on that journey of development to ensure that we get a product that is useful to everyone. So I think I'm happy to chat about that further in the presentation, but probably just to push on with the paper as it stands. At item 4, we talk about thematic inspection work. We have now published our inspection relating to the Climate Change Conference, COP26, which I'm glad to see went without too many problems. There was a huge amount of work put into the preparation for that particular conference, as I'm sure you're all aware, but the service had really played an integral part in ensuring that that conference went ahead safely, and that they were involved in that planning process, and we were very encouraged by that. That report did not have any recommendations in it, because it would be foolish to publish a report with recommendations in it when the conference is over, so the only sort of element within it that's worth continuing to keep a focus on is the provision of a response to marauding terrorist attacks, and I know that the board members and the service are completely focused on that, so I won't labour the point. The next thematic inspection, and it is ongoing, is in relation to firefighting in high-rise buildings. I've already spoken to the committee about this before. That inspection is well underway, but again has been delayed as a result of some of the restrictions around COVID-19, as you can imagine. We are, I think we are almost complete in relation to our field work in and around the service. We are, however, examining some of the procedures and policies in other metropolitan fire services across the UK to give us that national context. So we've had very encouraging discussions with West Midlands, Manchester and London around observing how they actually respond to these types of incidents. Now, having said that, and I've said it right at the start when we began this process, this will be a report that focuses on the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service's response to high-rise buildings in Scotland and the risk that exists in Scotland. However, I think it would be wrong of us, given that one of the primary drivers for this inspection was Grenfell Tower. It would be wrong of us not to at least observe and examine processes across the rest of the UK. But the built environment is very different in other cities, than it is in Scotland, and we will take that into cognizance. It will be a very Scottish-focused report. I personally attended a multi-appliance exercise in Ayrshire in Irvine, and the chief officer attended on the same day as me. Actually, it was a particularly cold day, and he was much better prepared for it than I was. So I was frozen, and he looked pretty comfortable in his full fire gear, etc. However, the exercise itself, when I attended it in September, I observed quite a few areas for improvement. However, when I then attended in December, it was very pleasing to see that many of those concerns had been addressed and that the policy had been modified and that the training input in the exercise had evolved significantly. And I was happy to report that evolution during my discussion with the Minister on that particular subject. So I think it is a work in progress. I think there is still improvement to be made, but it's encouraging for us to be able to observe that the service has learned from that exercise process. That is entirely the purpose of exercising, of course, is to find those opportunities for improvement and to put them in place. So moving on, health and safety thematic is coming to an end. Actually, our very last interview was with the Chief Officer, Martin, earlier this week. And we interviewed Martin in the context of his role as NFCC lead for health and safety rather than as Chief Officer. And that just kind of finished off the last piece of that field work for us. The health and safety thematic report is now in a very well advanced draft format, and I spent a full day on Tuesday reading through it, and I'll finish reading through it before the end of this week. Our next plan then is to have an informal discussion with the key stakeholders in Scottish Fire and Rescue to make sure that they are cited on any of the recommendations and observations within that report before we go to formal consultation, which is a 3-week process, as you know. And hopefully at the end of that consultation process, we can make any adaptations that we feel are appropriate and lay the document before Parliament before the end of the financial year. So we have timelined that, and that is all entirely achievable. But yeah, with a good bit of wind behind our sails, hopefully we'll have this before Parliament before the end of this financial year. This is slightly different in format, and it's maybe worth highlighting that in so much that the report itself not only has recommendations within it, but it also has a number of areas that we felt were worth consideration, but maybe not as formal as recommendations, and also within it some areas of good practice, which is something that we've not actually highlighted in previous reports, and we've overtly, published them in boxes and in bold font to actually provide that balance, because I think it's all too easy at times for us to observe and to comment on the negatives without perhaps paying proper consideration to some of the positive work that's ongoing. So hopefully the format will be something that you feel is a move in the right direction, but we're always open to suggestions if you feel it's something that's actually a step backwards. So hopefully that's not the case. The only other thing I wanted to mention, Chair, was that you and I had a discussion, I think it was last week, around my role within this committee and kind of anything that the inspectorate might be able to do in terms of working alongside internal audit and ensuring that our audit plans are aligned and that we're not actually overlapping, which has been the case in the past, as you know. So yes, I absolutely give a commitment to doing that, but I just must underline the fact that our inspection regime must remain independent, and we can't inspect in partnership with internal audit or anyone else in that respect. So I just want to be really clear about that. I'm happy to have the discussion when developing the annual plan. I'm happy to try and avoid duplication, but the actual inspection itself must remain independent in nature, and I'm sure Matt would absolutely agree that that's appropriate that we both operate in that fashion. The other thing that we discussed, and just to share it with other members of the committee, was that Since I have reformatted and reshaped my team, I have actually given every one of the assistant inspectors some responsibility for a particular function, and I asked the chair if it might be appropriate for me to bring along an assistant inspector as an observer to some of these meetings, with a view that that individual would then be my replacement on occasions when I am not available. The person in question would be a guy called Graham Fraser, who I think has attended this meeting in the past on behalf of my predecessor, Simon Ruth Jones. So he's well aware of how the committee operates, and I have every faith that he will operate himself very professionally. So with your permission, Chair, that would be my desire, to bring Graham along to a future meeting, and hopefully when I'm not available, he would deputise for me in my absence. I've got nothing further to present. I'm happy to take any questions.
Yeah, no, that's great, Robert. Thank you very much. And just to pick up the last couple of points there, absolutely delighted for Graham to come along and fully understand and support your position regarding independence. So just to be clear on that. Questions for Robert? Leslie?
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Robert. Questions is about the high-rise thematic. I'm wondering about whether you will be including a context or relating to the nature of the high-rise buildings that we have in Scotland. I know certainly I would find it useful to have that context, and I'm thinking in terms of building regs. So obviously how many we have at what different heights, how many private, how many commercial. But I'm struck by a story in the news at the moment about potential planning permission being given to a very tall building in London with only one staircase. So something about what is the nature of our building stock that the report refers to. And I don't know whether that would also include where our building regs are at. That may perhaps be beyond your scope. And the second point is in relation to whether you considered international benchmarking. New York Fire Department, for example. Did you think about doing any international benchmarking? Last point, Brian, is which committees will these reports go to? Can you just remind me? I know I should know that, but where will they come? Thank you.
So the first part of it, Leslie, in terms of building stock, yes, the easy answer to that is yes, it will include context. The report will define how many high-rise buildings fall into that category in Scotland, how many are commercial and how many are residential, and also the heights and the sort of structure of those buildings. And I think it'll be quite pleasing to read that, and that's why I think it's important that we set this context in place, because our buildings aren't particularly high in Scotland. They're not. I don't think there's any buildings higher than 26 floors, and in residential, I think we're talking at 21 floors in Scotland. So we're not got the 50-storey high-rise buildings that some other cities in the UK have. In relation to cladding, I think it's also important to touch on the issue of ACM cladding, which was one of the reasons for the Grenfell disaster, as you know. And again, Scotland finds itself in a particularly good place with that, and some remediation work that's already been done post Grenfell, and some very firm building regulations prior to that even occurring, have left us in a good place insofar as that I think there are only one set of buildings in Scotland that still have cladding over the entire surface. There are some that have it up to ground floor, but over the entire surface there's only one set, and the remediation work for removal of that has already begun. And one commercial building where there is cladding on the internal surfaces of that building, and that remediation work will start in February and conclude by September, we're told. So, I think we find ourselves in Scotland in a very good place in relation to our built environment and our building regs, and we want to emphasise that within the report when setting the context. In terms of the international benchmarking, I don't think we are actually benchmarking. I think we are simply comparing with the other UK fire and rescue services, and I think it's appropriate to do that given that we are all guided by the National Operational Guidance and the NFCC's position on firefighting in tall buildings, and therefore it's appropriate for us to compare how that's being applied. From my experiences as a member of the board of NFPA's firefighting section for many years over in the States, the differences are so stark that I don't think there would be any benefit in the benchmarking of how firefighting in high-rise buildings is applied in cities across UK as opposed to cities across USA, because I think the regulations around wearing a breathing apparatus are so different in each of those cities, and that national context is not there in the same way that it is in the UK, that we would get little from it. And equally, as much as I would be very tempted to hop on a plane over to New York for any purpose, I simply don't have the resources to stretch that far in relation to any benchmarking exercise that I might want to carry out. However, I would obviously encourage the service to continue to horizon scan across the whole of the world and not just across the UK.
Great, thanks for that, Robert. And on your question about which committees, I think there's a working assumption that most reports will go to the Service Delivery Committee, but certainly it's not until you actually see the contents of the report you can understand, because there may, particularly on the health and safety one, be multiple interests from a committee perspective.
Yeah, and what we can, the clearinghouse for us is in through the service. It's considered the Strategic Management Board and SLT, and the decision is taken there as to which direction it goes. That's not for us to decide, unfortunately. Yeah. Or fortunately, I don't particularly mind as long as someone's considering it.
As long as someone's taking the time, absolutely, absolutely. Paul, you did have your hand up. Did you want to come in?
Only very briefly to reassure Leslie. Post Grenfell, you've got to have 2 staircases over 18 metres in Scotland.
I thought that was the case, and I just find it terrifying what's happening in England. But yeah, but thank you for that, Paul. Appreciated.
Yeah, and probably just to add slightly to that very quickly, that ourselves, HMFSI and SFRS, both sit on the ministerial working group around post Grenfell, and anything that comes out of the inquiry around Grenfell is considered by ministers, and we are in that room at the time and having an opportunity to contribute.
Thank you. That's helpful clarification. Robert, as before, thank you very much for that report. I think all of the developments that you have outlined to me sound eminently sensible, and I think are moving your activities to something which is much more kind of risk-based, it feels, which certainly from the business of this committee feels entirely appropriate. So absolutely support that, and like the idea of a different format of report highlighting recommendations, good practice, because I always think about these things as being in the shoes of the person receiving it, and if everything that's written is in the negative, it can be quite soul destroying to read that. So very much welcome that, and your comments about real-time improvements being identified and applied. I mean, that is the process working really at its optimum and how ideally it should. Just one question from me on the high-rise one. 18 metres is the definition, but I'm aware that there is a limit to how far and how high firefighters are able to kind of operate, I think. And I was just curious what that limit was, and how the risks above that point are kind of being assessed and managed by the service, and whether your report would in any way talk to that point.
The report will talk to that point, and the issue is around being able to carry out an evacuation whilst wearing breathing apparatus without the cylinder becoming fully emptied by the time you get to the upper floors. The scientific data around the university studies would suggest that you can do that on a full tank up to 26 floors. So again, it's really important to set this in the context of Scotland. I think some of the services south of the border have bigger issues, and some of the controversial decisions that have been taken by some services around deploying firefighters not in air, not wearing their masks, and allowing them to wear their masks at a point at which they are required to do so. That becomes a little bit controversial, and has gathered attention from the rep bodies, and has gathered some negative attention nationally. I think Scotland, because of the context, and that's why it's so important to set that, and because of the building stock, finds itself in a much better position. I'm sure the Chief Officer could answer, to his own decisions on his own direction of travel on that, but it's maybe for another day. It's entirely up to you.
Yeah, no, it's. I was just curious about, the risks associated with that, and it'll be interesting, I think, just to see the report and see what it said, and there may be questions as a response to that, unless of course Martin wishes to comment at this stage. But I'm not seeking to extend the conversation. No. Okay, Robert, thank you very much for that. I was pleased when we did discuss last week that you confirmed your willingness to come along to this committee, because I think for you to get exposure to the business of this committee, which is perhaps at a more kind of corporate level, particularly in relation to risks, rather than the operational stuff that's primarily going on at Service Delivery Committee, I think is useful in just giving you that blend. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you.
And then that takes us on to the quarterly update on gifts, hospitality and interest. And David, are you going to talk briefly to this?
I am, Chair. Yes, thank you. The report provides the kind of at the end of the Q3 position, and Appendix A outlines the kind of 3 entries on the register at this present moment, which relate to interests. Separate to that, there was a separate declaration below the threshold within the policy on a monetary gift, and that was donated to the firefighters charity. I think as a kind of action point and discussion that we had, Chair, last committee, there was discussion about how we can better understand what's happening at more local level. And I think in looking at or comparing ourselves against some of the other fire services in the UK, some of the registers will have hospitality, will have monetary items of a higher significance, but they'll also have smaller elements, which might be a pizza, Easter egg, or small hamper that's kind of given in at a station. And I think in developing an LCMS training awareness package for gifts and hospitality, which we're currently doing, having a discussion with some of our kind of uniform colleagues, having discussion at the Good Governance Board, puts us in a position where we need to discuss this further at a local level to try and encourage additional awareness and maybe a kind of cultural change in terms of what's actually been handed in. Are we talking about low level items that we wouldn't normally report and would not normally see within the register, or other areas that you should be getting sight of, and because of a lack of awareness, they're not coming through. So I think what I've tried to outline within the report is there are a number of different areas that we have for interests, whether it's through SLT and board members. There's the user intelligence groups for procurement. We put out kind of information through communication before, and we've got a new policy which we communicated. But the essence now is to actually use the gifts hospitality policy, the training package, together with discussions at a local level to try and really understand what do local stations experience on a monthly, quarterly basis, and use that information to inform us. And it could be that in the future that we try to provide some level of knowledge below the threshold, just to give you a feeling of what's actually happening locally, as well as still maintaining that kind of comfort that anything more significant over the £50 is coming through to yourself. So the purpose of the report is to say there's a refreshed look at how we can provide assurance to yourself, and over the coming year, I'll be honest, it would be looking to provide that additional information to you based upon those discussions that we'll have, and I'll try and answer any questions that you'll have. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Questions for David? No. David, again, my interest in this is the effectiveness of the system, the policy, and I have to say, 3 recorded interests since April of last year, with a workforce of 7,000 and odd, feels low to me. I would also observe that in 2 of the instances, the interest was identified not by the individual themselves, but by other routes. So the volume of interest that are being declared by individuals is extremely low. Now, perhaps I'm just a cynic, but for an organisation of this scale, with such diversity, it's worryingly low. And my position kind of remains that I'm not particularly assured about the effectiveness of particularly the interest part of this policy. But I recognise that that it's a new policy. Its effectiveness still probably has to be fully judged, and I note the actions that are being taken, particularly around the training package and the additional work around comms, and wonder if you could tell us when these things are to be done, and in the case of training, whether the training will be made mandatory.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of the LCMS package, and again, I'm looking at this in conjunction with the LCMS package we created for fraud, that the package will be created by the end of March, so that's already underway, and there's a bit for the actual team involved in LCMS that they take what we give them and they put it into a more sensible manner that actually flows, that people can use. So that's the first bit that we would do by the end of March. The discussions we've had with kind of uniform colleagues and with the Good Governance Board has drawn me to the conclusion that the LCMS package isn't the thing that's going to actually change something. And in terms of actually putting both fraud and gifts and hospitality training within the kind of core competencies of kind of staff is something that discussions are being held on to ensure that, and again, I don't have the timescales, but over a rolling programme of a year or 2 years, whatever it is that staff have to complete their training packages over, the gifts and hospitality and fraud will become part of that. The next bit is the provision of assurance that it's how we can actually ensure that the package that we have developed is something that staff gain benefit from. What I might think is actually really good, they might come back to say that's not giving me the answers or it's not raising the questions in my own head. So I suppose when I'm talking about going out to a couple of pilot stations to get that feedback will start to help further develop the package, but it will also start the discussions that says how can you at a local level begin to provide some flow of information about what's happening at a local level. And by that, it's the small things. It's the small kind of gifts that come in. It's the small kind of pizzas or curries that are given by the local community into the station. It's for me to get a better idea of what we're actually having, to then come back to yourself and start to develop that conversation about, is the current policy and the way we report and the threshold we have suitable in terms of providing that assurance, or do we need to do something different? So, Chair, I think it's just we can develop the package, but it's the discussion that I'm now thinking about at a local level that will actually hopefully make things a bit different, make the package a bit more useful, and my intention is to make it available or as a core standard for people to kind of read through as part of their training.
Right. Thanks, David. Can I just perhaps clarify? Did you say that you didn't believe that the LCMS package would be particularly effective? And also, in response to my question about whether the training would be mandatory, are you saying that if it becomes part of or if it becomes defined as a core competency, it will be mandatory? I wonder if you could just clarify, because I'm not entirely sure.
Okay, my understanding is if it's part of the core competency, it will be mandatory. And I will receive confirmation back and give that back to you, Chair. In terms of the LCMS package, in my head, I may not have conveyed it. In isolation, the LCMS package on its own is probably not going to be the thing that's going to suddenly change something. It's the LCMS package, the discussion on that package, and then the additional awareness and reporting at a local level that collectively will actually, I hope, provide some additional assurance.
Mm-hmm. And sorry, in terms of whether it becomes a core competency, is that a decision that's yet to be made? And would it only become mandatory if it became a core competency?
There's a group that actually prepares the kind of core competency at a uniform level, and we've provided the LCMS package on fraud to them to incorporate within their governance training. And my understanding is that group's got that information. If they agree it, and I've not heard anything back to say they have not agreed that, it will be core. If it isn't part of that package, I would be looking for a different method to ensure that, similar to ICT training or behaviour and equalities training, that there's another means by which we can make it mandatory for individuals or employees to do.
Okay, I guess, Martin, you're with us. You will have a view on this. I would appreciate your view.
So it will become part of the 3-year rolling programme. So training for operational competence and the associated documents are on the 3-year rolling programme for all operational staff. And then there's a separate training programme for flexi-duty staff that will become part of that as a mandatory core competence that you then undertake the LCMS package and sign off. So that's an easy way to do it. It is the only way to do it. We've then got a proper audit trail. I think David's quite right. The LCMS package in itself won't do very much, I suspect. It'll be the understanding of why we're actually asking for this. And this fire stations have received GIST for as long as I can remember. In fact, way beyond me being a firefighter, and a long time ago now. It is something that happens as part of being in the local community. So understanding why we're asking for this information is really important, because the fear will be, understandably, you're trying to stop something that actually the community want to support us in, and that's not the reason for doing so. So it's how we approach this. We can approach this through the district officers and the LSO teams to make sure actually that understanding around fraud and influence is very clear in terms of this, and it's not trying to stop it, but it's asking you to record it, so actually we can assess when we are awarding contracts that we have not been unduly influenced at any stage in the awarding of the contracts, etc.
Yeah.
So that will be in hand, and I appreciate the work David's been doing on this to get us to the place where we should be.
And I absolutely don't have an issue with any of that. I just wonder whether the emphasis on the interests part of it is perhaps being lost or not given enough prominence. But you know, let's leave that sticking to the wall then. But as ever, David, you know, it'll be interesting to see as these reports continue to come through to us just what progress is being made. So thanks very much for that.
Thank you.
Okay. So that takes us to pretty much the end of the agenda. We've got review of actions now. Heather, do you have a note of these? Do you want me to try and summarise them for you? How do you want to do this?
I've got a note. I've got 5 actions noted. Chair.
Okay, if you run through those, please.
So under item 7.1, internal audit progress report. Any audit activity that's deferred should be an anticipated timescale provided when it will be undertaken.
Okay.
Again, under item 7.1, under the fire safety enforcement report, we have 2 actions against that. Further discussions between HMFSI, internal audit and the service, and also a fuller update on recommendations to be given at the next meeting.
Okay.
Under item 7.2, progress update internal audit recommendations, of a narrative to be added to the report around the management considerations and also around original control weaknesses and what has been done to resolve them. Under item 8, independent audit inspection action plan update, remove HMFSI from the heading on Appendix B.
Okay, that's good. Another couple of points from me was just that it was in relation to the internal audit section. It was around looking at the opportunities for the piece of work to add more value, and that's a task I think that we'll attribute to Azet, but as we said earlier, it's a bit of a shared endeavour. And the only other point I had was a clarification of RAC's role in relation to the whistleblowing policy.
Okay, thanks, Chair.
Okay, are people content that we've captured the substance of the actions? Excellent. Okay, and then that takes us on to the forward plan. Any comments on the forward plan? No. Just a couple of things from me. In terms of the March meeting, understanding items, we have gifts, hospitality, quarterly update scored out for the March meeting. Not sure why it says period not complete. I don't understand what that means. And again, for that meeting, workforce planning is for scrutiny, but we have agreed today to defer that. But there will be a report, presumably, on fraud investigation that will need to be added in. And you will see under scrutiny, there is reference to the whistleblowing policy that will obviously be clarified. Okay, but apart from those comments, I had no further comments. Okay, well, in that case, that draws the public meeting to a close. The next meeting is Thursday, the 30th of March. And thank you to everyone for participating, and that now formally closes the public meeting.